Today we have an explanation of the library management system with database integration project. We're going to start by going through the files. We have our author utilities, our author class, our book utilities, our book class, a MySQL helper, genre utilities, and the genre class, user utilities and the user class, our main Python file where we have the menus, and then of course we also have a README and a create database.sql file for in the event that a user does not already have the database set up. And now we're going to start with our main file where we have our imports. We set up our library. We set up our dictionaries to hold all of our objects and information about the library. And then we start with our main class, where first we call our establish database function out of our connect.mysql.py, which we'll go over later. And that just sets up the database and everything, make sure everything is correct and ready to go. From there we load from the database all of our information, including our genres, authors, users, and books. And then we go on to the main menu. And from the main menu, we get to choose, do we want to do book operations, user operations, author operations, genre operations, or quit back to the main system. And for book operations, we have another menu where we can choose to add a new book, borrow a book, return a book, search for a book, display all books, or return to the main menu. And when we make a selection in the book menu, we will be taken to other. And when we make our selection from the book menu, we will be moved on to other functions within our book utilities PY, and we will go over those. When we choose user operations, we'll be brought to the user menu, where we can choose to add a new user, view user details, display all users, or return to the main menu. When we choose author operations, we will get to choose from add a new author, view an author's details, display all authors, or return to the main menu. When we choose genre operations, we will also get to choose to add a new genre, view specific genre details, display all genre details, or return to the main menu. And now we will go over our base classes for our authors, books, genres, and users. We'll start here with authors. And when we start out, we have a name, a biography, and then an author ID generated by the database automatically. So we also have a function here to get that author ID from the database when we initialize the class object. And here we have our getters and setters, where we will automatically update the database whenever we change anything in the class object, along with our requisite error handling and closures. Get a getter and setter for the biography, and then we have a getter for the author ID, and then here is our get author ID from database function from earlier, where we will execute a query to get the ID from the authors that match the name and biography, and then that will be returned and part of our base class, returned and become part of our class object as well. Here is our book class, where we will start out with our genre ID, title, author ID, the ISBN number for the book, the publication date, and a boolean for the availability, along with our book ID from the database. We have our getters and setters here, where they get for the book ID, get the title, set the title and update it in the database. We have our our getter for the genre ID, and then we have a getter that returns the name of the genre. So we have our getter for the author ID that gets the author ID from the books table in the database. We have our setter for the author, which updates the database as well. We have our get ISBN, which returns from the class object. And then we have our set ISBN, which updates both the database and the object. We have our publication date getters and setters. Then we have the get availability, which returns a text string of available or borrowed, depending on how it is set in the class currently. We have our set borrowed method, which will update the availability in the database and then in the object. And then we have our set available method, which will again change it in the database first and then update the object. And then we have our little get book ID from database helper method, which will, on initialization, get the ID from the database so that we can use that in the dictionary. And finally, we have our user class here. We will initialize with a name, the library ID, and then the database generated user ID. We have our getter for the name. We have our setter for their name, which updates the database and the object. We have our library ID getter and setter, which operate the same way. We have a helper method to get the borrowed books from the borrowed book table in our database, and just select the ones with our user ID. Then we have our get user ID from database method, which is called on initialization and just gets the ID from the user table where the name and the library ID match. And now we will go over all of our helper functions. And we'll start with our author utilities. And we'll start with all our functions called directly from the menu. So we have our add author function here, where we get the name and biography from the operator. Then we use that to insert a new entry into our authors table using that name and biography. And then we update a new author into the author dictionary. Then we have our view author details, which will display the information about the author we select. We will get an author name from the operator, get the ID from that name, and then use that name to pull the information from the dictionary and display it. Then we have our display all authors function here, which will basically just take the author dictionary, iterate through it, and then display the author information using our display author helper function, which is right here. And this one just basically takes the author information and displays it to the user. And then we have another helper function here called getAuthor that takes the name and returns the ID of the author that we put the name in for. And then we have our load authors from database function that we call on initializing the program. And this just basically selects everything from the authors table in the database and enters it into author class objects into our author dictionary. And we get here we have our book utilities, where we will start with our add book function, where we will insert into our books table and our books dictionary information from the user about a new book, including title, author, a publication date that we will validate after getting it from the user, a genre, which we will get the genre ID from to add into our table and object. And at that time we will execute the query and create the book object in the book dictionary. Now we have our borrowed book function, where we will insert into our borrowed books table the user ID and the book, and then we will also generate a borrow date and return date and add those as well. So we get the user and book from the operator. Then we generate today's date for borrowing, And we add a time delta of 14 days to get the return date 2 weeks later. We get our book ID from the title given to us. And then we check on the availability of the book. And if it is available to borrow, we will execute our query and then set borrowed on the book in question. And now return will be the opposite. We will delete from our borrowed books table the entry that has this user ID and the book ID that we will be getting from our operator. And when we get we will make sure that we get our user ID from the information given. Then we'll get our book ID as well. And at that point, we will check the availability, make sure the book hasn't already been returned. At which point we'll execute our query and update the book object. Now we have our search books function. Here we will get a choice to either search by title, by author, by ISBN number, or by genre. We'll start with search by title, where we get the title that we're looking for from the operator, generate it, get its ID, and then display that book to the user. Then we have the search by author, where we get the author name from the operator. We use the author name to get the books from the database that are all attributed to this author. Then, if that does return any results, we check see if there's one result, in which case we just display that one result. Otherwise, what we will do is we will get the results, iterate through them, and display that to the user, at which point we will ask the user to choose which book they want to view the full details of. Here we have our search ISBN, where we just get the ISBN number. Then we use our helper function to get the book ID from the ISBN number and display that book. And finally, we have search by genre, where we get the genre name from the operator. We use that to get back our books from that genre in our database. Then if we have results, if there's only one, immediately show it with the display books. Otherwise, like earlier, we will just iterate through the list and show the user that and ask them to choose which title. And here we have our display all book function, which, if there are books in the book dictionary, will iterate through them, displaying all the information about the book. Otherwise, if there are no books in the library, we will notify the user of that. Here we have the display book function called by search books, which just takes the book ID given and displays all the information from that book ID. Here is our get books by author function, where we get all the books by one author by taking our author ID given and getting all the books from the books table in their database. At which point, if there are results, they will be added to a list for returning. Otherwise, the return will be none. We have a book ID from ISBN function called in the search books, where we basically just pass it the ISBN, and whatever book has that ISBN in the database will be returned. And since that is ISBNs are singular to a single book, we should only get one result. Here's the book ID from title function, which does just that. Give it a title, and then we'll select the ID from our database that matches that title. If there's more than one, it will list them out along with the author, so to make it easier to choose exactly which title you are looking for the ID of. A small function here just to validate that the input from the user is a valid date. And here we have our load books from database, which, like with the author's loading function, just gets everything from the books table and adds it into the book dictionary as book objects. And now we're on to our genre utilities. We will start with add genre, where we get the name, description, and category from the user, insert those into our genres table, and then create a genre object to add to our genre dictionary. And here we have our view genre details function, where we'll get the name of the genre the operator wants to view, get the genre ID, and if the genre ID exists within our dictionary, we will display that genre's information. Otherwise, we will notify the user that there are no genres in the library, and we would ask them if they want to add it or not. There we have our display all genres function, where we just iterate through the genres dictionary, displaying all the information. And here is the display genres function, which just takes the genre by the name given, gets the ID if it's available, and displays information. We have a helper function to get the genre ID. We will put in the name. We will query the database for the ID from the genres table where the name matches, and we will return that result. We have a get books from genre function, which takes the name of the genre and passes it through the get genre ID function, and then queries the database to get the ID of books that are within the genre ID. At which point we will verify that there are results. If there's a single result, we will singularly pass it to the return value. Otherwise, we will append a list of return values. Or if there are none, we will have a none return value. And our last genre function will be load genres from database, where again, we just get all of our information from the genres table and load it as genre objects into our genre dictionary. And our final utilities will be our user utilities, starting with the add user, where we will take the name from the operator. We will generate a randomized library ID, at which point we will make sure that the library ID is not already in use. If it is, we will regenerate it, at which point we will insert the name and library ID into a new user in the users table, and then create a new user object in our user dictionary. Here we have our view user details function, where we'll get a name or library ID of the user. We will use that information to get the user ID, at which point we will display the user. And here we have our display user function, which takes the given ID, and if it is in the dictionary, we'll display all the information about that user, including the borrowed books, which it will query from the database using the get borrowed function from our user. We have our display all users function, which just iterates through the user dictionary, displaying all the information about the users within there. We have a get user ID from name function, which will take the name we give it and query the database for a user's ID with that name. We have a get user ID from library ID function, which, like the previous function, will query the database and get the ID of the user where the library ID matches. We have a function to generate the library IDs, which generates a random 10-digit number string and returns it. And finally, we have our loader from the database, which just takes everything from the users table and loads it as user objects into the user dictionary. Our final file to go through is our connect.mysql.py. And here we have our connect database function, which just logs into the database and returns the connection. And we have our establish database function, which we call when we start up the program. And this just establishes the connection, makes sure that there are all the tables there. If not, it will create the table in the database for us and then return us back to our main program. And here we have a little helper function for setup tables that you just pass it a string for which table you need, and based on that string, it will use the queries provided to generate the new table we need. And now we have our book utilities. Here we start with our add book, where we get the information from the user about our title and our author. Then we get the publication date and validate that to make sure that it will enter into the and we get here we have our book utilities, where we will start with our add book function, where we will insert into our books table and our books dictionary information from the user about a new book, including title, author, a publication date that we will validate after getting it from the user, a genre, which we will get the genre ID from to add into our table and object, and at that time we will execute the query and create the book object in the book dictionary. And then we have our borrow book function, which and then we have our borrow book function, where we will insert into the borrowed books table the borrowed book and then update the user that is borrowing the book to make sure that the and now we have our borrowed book function, where we will insert into our borrowed books table the user ID and the book, and then we will also generate a borrow date and return date and add those as well. So we get the user from and so we get the user and book from the user from the so we get the user and book from the operator. Then we generate today's date for borrowing, and we add a time delta of 14 days to get the return date 2 weeks later. We get our book ID from the title given to us, and then we check on the availability of the book, and if it is available to borrow, we will execute our query and then set borrowed on the book in question. And now return will be the opposite. We will delete from our borrowed books table the entry that has this user ID and the book ID that we will be getting from our operator. And when we get we will make sure that we get our user ID from the information given. Then we'll get our book ID as well. And at that point, we will check the availability, make sure the book hasn't already been returned, at which point we will execute our query and update the book object. Now we have our search books function. Here we will get a choice to either search by title, by author, by ISBN number, or by genre. We'll start with search by title, where we just get the title that we're looking for from the user. We'll start with search by title, where we get the title that we're looking for from the operator, generate it, get its ID, and then display that book to the user. Then we also we have search by author, where we get the author number. And we have search by author, where we get the author name from the user. Then we have the search by author, where we get the author name from the operator. We use the author name to get the books from the database that are all attributed to this author. Then, if that does return any results, we check to see if there's one result, in which case we just